Hey there, it's LegenTerry. We're getting pretty close to the middle of the year. Technically, next month marks the true middle, but with the Switch 2 launching, I'm going to be hyper-focused on putting out content around that, so I figured now would be my best opportunity to talk about some of the games I haven't had time to cover individually from the first half of 2025. That, and I accidentally made a content commitment to a couple of these games by accepting codes which I didn't know had deadlines attached. Whoops. Just to get ahead of it, I was already interested in these couple of games, which is why I asked for the codes in the first place. I had just planned on covering them a little later in the year, so instead they're getting bumped up on the schedule. With that out of the way, full disclosure, I received the code for South of Midnight from Xbox and Compulsion Games, and a code for Hyper Light Breaker from Arc Games, both through keymailer.com. Thank you. Now, this video isn't going to cover everything I've played this year. Some games I want to spend more time with before I give any opinions on them, and others are big enough that I want to dedicate an entire video to them on their own. That means you, Expedition 33. Plus, I'm kind of in a rush. So today, we're going to look at 5 games from the first half of the year that piqued my interest. Oh, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe. First up is Avowed, coming from Obsidian Entertainment and Xbox Game Studios. Avowed is an action RPG set in the Pillars of Eternity universe. I don't know a damn thing about the Pillars of Eternity universe, but what I do know is that Avowed is pretty cool. If you've watched my most recent video covering the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered, you know that I'm a pretty big fan of Oblivion and Skyrim. Well, if you took Oblivion, made it a little more linear, gave it some parkour mechanics, and improved the weakest part of it several times over, that being the combat, you'd basically get Avowed. You play as what is called a godlike, a being who was marked by a deity at birth with an unnatural appearance. Unfortunately, you drew the short straw, which means you got mushrooms growing out your face. You also don't know which one of the gods blessed you with that privilege, which turns into one of the game's leading mysteries. It takes place in a magical world called Aora, being threatened by a plague called the Dream Scourge, which strangely enough is also signified by people turning all mushroomy. But when it happens to them, they start to lose their minds and crave violence. Huh. I could swear I've seen this one before somewhere. Anyways, when you were a kid, you were taken under the care of the king of the Adirian Empire, your homeland, because of just how special you were. A king whom a lot of folks in the Living Lands aren't very enthusiastic about because he keeps sending his military to shake down the locals and to try to get them to follow his laws. Now he sent you there to figure out the source of the Dream Scourge business before it can continue to spread. It's not a bad way to start off a story. They pretty much let you mold your character from the ground up, and they give you some interesting choices to make along the way when you're deciding who you want to be. There are a few companions that come along for the ride, though the ones I've had in tow for the first third of the game don't really seem all too exciting, but they have some abilities that help you in combat, and you get to choose which ones to upgrade. The same goes for yourself, of course. This is an RPG after all. There are some pretty unique weapon types and skills that go along with them. Not a lot of games out there let you wield a gun in one hand and a spellbook in the other. But Avowed really leans into whatever power fantasy you can imagine. You want to be a berserker? Sure, rush down those enemies with a big chunky two-handed weapon. Want to be a gunslinging cowboy? Toss on a couple of pistols and spec into faster reloads. Or is Harry Potter more your speed? Well, grab a wand and stupefy some nerds. And hey, dodging and parrying feels fantastic too. When you aren't smacking bad guys around, you can chat with the citizens for some side quests and explore the Living Lands to your heart's content. There are tons of secret chests and items everywhere that you look, and being able to jump and climb your way over most things makes traversal extremely fun. Hopefully I get back around to finishing Avowed sometime soon because I really like the time that I spent with it. The ironic part is I might have to take another break from it to try out Obsidian's next game, The Outer Worlds 2, when it comes out later this year. Next up is Hyper Light Breaker from Heart Machine and Arc Games. Hyper Light Breaker is an oddball. The original game, Hyper Light Drifter, was one of my favorite indie games of all time. It was a 2D, top-down perspective action-adventure game with really simple but effective combat, unspoken minimalistic storytelling, and a breathtaking pixel art aesthetic that merged cyberpunky synthwave neons with a post-apocalyptic world overrun by nature. The map was expertly handcrafted, sprinkled with hidden golden bits you needed to unlock doors and gates that blocked off progress to certain areas, and other stuff that you needed to find to upgrade your health and your combat prowess. It was a majestic and bold game that knew exactly what it was doing. Hyper Light Breaker does none of that, or at least very little. In fact, save for some UI elements, some returning enemies, sound effects, and the color scheme, you'd have a pretty hard time recognizing this as a sequel at all. It's a co-op focused, extraction-based roguelike game where you take control of a character called a Breaker. Your goal is to explore the Overgrowth, a procedurally generated wasteland of ruins inhabited by various baddies, collect powerful loot by clearing them out, level your character up, and eventually take on the intimidating crown bosses who are holed up in lockdown fortresses. And that's what turned me away from Breaker in the first place. I wanted a true sequel, and I had basically zero interest in the style of game that they were building. Kinda like a couple of other projects that are currently sharing the spotlight. It launched in early access back in January, but I didn't bother picking it up. The general consensus from players was that it was a disappointing mishmash of ideas that didn't live up to the potential its predecessor had established. And that was a very sad and bitter pill for me to swallow. While I never got around to trying the version of the game that came out 4 months ago, I have spent some time with the current iteration, though I've only had time to try it solo. The first major update, titled Buried Below, which promised some major shakeups in the foundational systems and the playability, came out just a few days ago. While I'm still not sold on the core of the game revolving around extraction, it seems now to be much more focused on the roguelike side of the coin, which, sure, that gets my approval, I guess. Every time you head into the Overgrowth, you get a starter melee weapon, a gun, and 1 life to live. Your health bar is very limited at the beginning of the run, and you only have 1 medkit unless you've managed to unlock a permanent upgrade back at the base. There are some small ways to get amounts of health back, but nothing substantial, unless you use the in-game currency to buy some at a shrine. If there's any note that Hyperlight Breaker did take seriously from Drifter, it's just how harrowing the combat experience can be. Even the smallest enemy can present some danger when it's part of a larger force, and you don't give it your full attention. You need to retain every bit of health that you can muster for the boss fights, and chip damage threatens to end your cycles early if you aren't careful. Your basic abilities feel pretty smooth to control, attacks, dashes, and parries are very responsive, and you can flow between actions very quickly. Actually, as far as I'm aware, you can activate a parry in the middle of your attack animations, which means you really only need to keep track of when enemies are coming in for a swing, or if you're in range of one of their AoE attacks. There's also some kind of staggering mechanic that I haven't fully wrapped my head around yet, because the game doesn't really tell you how to use it. It throws a lot at you at once, but at least they've now put in a tutorial for the most essential functions, which wasn't there before. And the tools they give you for exploration are actually really fun. You get a double jump, 2 dashes, the ability to dash up short walls, a glider, and a hoverboard that you can pull out at any time for covering long gaps. The map itself feels a little barren sometimes, a side effect of randomly generating what you'll encounter in each seeded version, but there is a pretty wide variety of structures and encounter types to run into. The things I'd really like to see them improve on are the targeting system and the incoming attack warnings, along with just explaining what any of the stuff you collect and extract with is actually used for back in the city hub. It kind of feels like they jammed Dark Souls targeting in here, which doesn't really work when you're up against like 10 enemies at once. I put the same critique against Elden Ring Night Rain during its beta test for the same reason, and here it might be even worse for a couple of reasons. One is that there's almost no visual indication of which enemy you're actually targeting, which is rough when a lot of enemies are grouped together. 2 is that enemies who fly feel almost impossible to hit with melee weapons unless you're directly on top of them, which means you probably want to use your gun. Which leads me to 3. Aiming your gun removes your targeting lock-on, so you're inclined not to use it when you're surrounded. That's an odd choice, and I hope they change it if it's not already an option buried in a menu somewhere. If they can solve that problem, tutorialize some features more clearly, and add some more content down the road, Hyperlight Breaker still wouldn't be the game that I wanted, but it might just be able to stand on its own as something else that I like. Third on the list is Split Fiction by Hazelight Studios and the mind of one Joseph Ferris. You know, the guy that said that one thing the one time.
Okay, can you swear here? Can you swear? Okay. The Oscars, you know? The Oscars! You!
Yeah, that guy. Split Fiction is a co-op only narrative adventure game in the same vein as their previous 2 games, A Way Out and It Takes Two. Unfortunately, because of the nature of these games and the impossibility of scheduling time with your adult friends, I have gotten to play neither one. Although I did play their first game, Brotherhood, A Tale of Two Sons, a long time ago, if that counts for anything. Split Fiction tells the tale of 2 female writers, one named Mio, who favors gritty sci-fi stories, and another named Zoe, whose taste lies in whimsical fantasy. They briefly meet each other in the elevator of an office building owned by a company that promises to publish their book concepts via a futuristic machine that turns their ideas into virtual realities that they can experience for themselves. Zoe, who's very outgoing and naive, willingly goes along with this experiment and dives straight in. But Mio, the more pessimistic and apprehensive of the pair, sees the strange stasis pods her fellow writers were shuffled into and decides she wants nothing to do with this. As the employees aggressively attempt to coerce her back towards the platform, she tries to flee but accidentally falls into Zoe's pod. When Mio gains consciousness again, she finds herself inside of Zoe's fantasy world. The pair squabble a bit about the situation until they realize that there's now a glitched portal torn in the space where Mio entered, and touching it sends them both into her sci-fi themed world instead. They're eventually able to catch a glimpse of reality outside the machine they're in, uncovering that the company who operates them plan to steal all of the stories these writers have created, giving zero credit to the writers at all and taking the monetary gains for themselves. Since the pods were only meant to hold one person at a time, nobody knows what will happen if they try to pull one of the girls out. So the only option the duo have is to cooperate with each other, jumping back and forth between their virtual worlds to finish their stories, in hopes that doing so will break them out of their makeshift prisons. Now, if you think about any of this for more than 2 minutes, you're going to be able to poke holes in every plot point, but that's because the story isn't really meant to be airtight. It's allegorical for the way companies misappropriate creativity to turn a profit while the real artists behind the success suffer. It's not exactly groundbreaking commentary, but it's a story that a lot of us have become all too familiar with over the years. The attitude of Hazelight's boss and the review scores of Split Fiction are a nice way to remind the other guys up top that they are reliant on the creatives, and that abusing that relationship or sacrificing them to appease shareholders makes you a piece of shit. So what else does Split Fiction have going on? Well, just like Hazelight's previous games, the lifeblood it operates on is a sheer variety in gameplay. It could be called a platformer puzzle game, but there's just a lot more to it than that. Not only are you warping between two vastly different worlds themed around sci-fi and fantasy, but you're also partaking in many different activities within each one. One moment, you're running through an obstacle course towards the camera like Crash Bandicoot to get away from trolls. The next, you're using laser whips and teleportation swords to leap through traffic in a highway full of flying cars. Then you're a pair of pigs who fart rainbows and grow like springs collecting fruit on a farm. Followed by a motorcycle chase where one of you drives and the other tries to solve a CAPTCHA puzzle on her phone to prevent the bike from self-destructing. And all of that happens in like the first hour and a half. I started playing this with one of my nephews, and on viewing the footage again, yeah, he's probably a little too young for some of the content. There's a lot of swearing and some questionable moments. If you play at the end of that pig level, you'll find out for yourself. But, I mean, kids these days are playing Call of Duty and GTA, so like, I'm sure he's seen worse. Anyways, the point I'm getting to is that he's under 10 years old and he didn't have any problems learning the controls. He only needed a little bit of guidance on the mechanics when it wasn't extremely obvious what our next objective was, and just had a lot of fun torturing me with the friendly fire. Really gave me the old Portal 2 co-op vibes, where half the joy you could derive was solving puzzles, and the other half was dropping your friend into a pool of acid when they least expected it. For the most part, I played as Mio and he had Zoe, but since the control scheme is pretty generalized for sprinting, jumping, and performing whichever action your character has access to at the moment, it was pretty easy to swap controllers back and forth to try out each other's new stuff. Unfortunately, he has the attention span of, well, a kid, so we only got to play about 3 hours before he wanted to do something else. But I'm still itching to get back to it and see how far they can push their spin on gameplay. When the first trailer for South of Midnight from Compulsion Games and Xbox Studios came out, it got a lot of people talking for one reason or another. For starters, it has this kind of stop-motion, claymation-y art style where they skip around frames akin to what the Spider-Verse films do, but it looks a little more tangible. In fact, the whole intro sequence is actual claymation, while the rest of the game uses models that were scanned in from handmade clay maquettes, reminding me of last year's Harold Halibut. And the designs of some of the characters and the environments kind of evoke a less cartoony Coraline, in my opinion. It's set in a gothic fantasy version of the bayous in the American Deep South, and features a black female protagonist dealing with mythical figures from folktale stories. We don't see most of those elements represented in video game form very often. If there's anything that Compulsion has gotten really good at over their tenure as a studio, it's choosing an interesting setting and presentation and putting their full weight behind it. And although they've struggled in the past with other stuff like molding the story around their concepts, South of Midnight delivers in that department. It's a mostly narrative-focused experience, but it features quite a bit of platforming and maybe too much combat for most people's taste. In that aspect, it brings me back to playing the Psychonauts games, which suffer from the same imbalance. I really enjoy those games, but I'm also not blind to how lopsided they feel. And unfortunately, South of Midnight doesn't manage to tackle combat with much more grace than Double Fine was able to there. But we'll wrap back around to that in a minute. Let me just set the stage for the story first. You play as Hazel, a teenager who's home alone and preparing to evacuate because a hurricane is set to slam into her community. She's feeling a little spiteful towards her mother Lacey at the time because she's running late leaving her job doing social work instead of helping Hazel pack. When she finally arrives, they get into a heated argument and Hazel walks out to check on her neighbors. While she's away, the storm kicks up and their house is swept away in the flood with her mother still trapped inside. Hazel chases it down the river until she can't go any further, so she turns to her estranged grandmother that lives in a mansion on a nearby hill. For some reason, Lacey had bad blood with her deceased husband's mother that she would never tell Hazel about, but getting her help is Hazel's last resort. Along the way, she begins to see mysterious wisps of thread flowing through the air, and while her grandmother, aka Bunny, is pretty aloof to Lacey's well-being, she seems oddly curious when Hazel mentions seeing the threads. She says they'll get emergency services to help in the morning and puts Hazel up in a guest bedroom for the night, but when she wakes up, she finds the doors are locked. After escaping out the window, she hears the threads singing and whispering to her and leading her back into a secret room behind a bookshelf in her grandmother's study. There, she finds a pair of hooks that can manipulate the threads, and some clues that her ancestors may have been weavers, people that could see the grand tapestry of life, and stigma, a dark energy that manifests in places where great sources of trauma took place. And once enough stigma builds up, it gives way to some disturbing spirit creatures called haints, which weavers need to unravel so that the land can flourish again. As she strikes out on her own to find her mother and uncover her family's history, Hazel has run-ins with other people and subjects of several folktales, many of which have their own secrets and past traumas that need healing. Back to the presentation, South of Midnight is really beautiful a lot of the time, which you might not expect from a game set in the swamplands. Compulsion was able to nail the way that the light from the sun gets reflected off the surface of the water at dusk, and the way that fog that settles over the marsh looks in the distance. And one of the most important pieces of the presentation is the soundtrack, which employs a lot of southern folk music and jazzy numbers to further play into the setting. The composer, Olivier de Rivière, whose name I hope I didn't just butcher, also decided to use a lot of vocalization on the tracks, which gives a lot of moments like the boss fights this really cinematic feel. Like you're dodging around the massive jaws of this giant albino alligator named Two-Toed Tom while the banjos and the organs play, and this choir of children are whispering Two-Toed Tom in your ear with a woman singing about him coming to eat you. Like, it's kinda corny, but it's also pretty endearing. Now, the combat itself is not all too great. It almost always takes place in a predetermined ring-shaped arena, and it doesn't feel particularly well designed or responsive enough to make up the largest chunk of the gameplay, but it does. Since the designs of the haints are pretty abstract, sometimes it's hard to tell whether they're just standing there idle or preparing to launch an attack. The developers reward you for dodging away in that brief moment, but in my opinion, it just isn't telegraphed well enough most of the time. It also feels like there's too much time between the cooldowns of your Weaver abilities, which means most of the time, you're just landing 2 to 3 hits of your standard 5-hit combo before needing to dodge away and repeating the process until the enemies fall. Even though I know I've only got like 5 hours left to the game, I don't know if I'll go back and finish South of Midnight. If I do, it'll just be to see how the rest of the story plays out, but I'll probably just drop the difficulty down to easy so I can experience it without being hindered. I like the setting, the characters, and the soundtrack, but I'm really not sure if that's enough to bring me back around if the combat system doesn't expand into something greater. Last up is Star of Providence, and this one's a little complicated. Technically, it was developed and self-published by Team D13 back in 2017 under the name Monolith, but I never actually heard about it until last year when Video Game Dunkey's publishing house Big Mo took it under their wing and announced it was getting a bunch of new content, rebranding with a new name, and coming to new platforms in February of this year. If you had already bought it on Steam when it was still named Monolith, the new version didn't cost anything extra. Neat. When it comes to genre, this game has a very unlikely pairing. It's a roguelike bullet hell shoot 'em up that also has some wacky characters and a bit of lore tucked away for the more dedicated players to find. And you're probably wondering how that combination works. Well, for starters, the actual area that the game operates within has a narrow aspect ratio. It's not vertical like normal shoot 'em ups, where you'd be moving northwards, or horizontal like the ones where the screen scrolls sideways. Since you're supposed to move and shoot in 360 degrees around targets, the field you play in is a square that doesn't move at all. The way this works as a roguelike is that each run has a randomized map made of these interlocked square rooms. Some rooms have doors leading to other rooms, some are dead ends, and some have breakable walls or secret doors that can only be accessed with bombs. There are a bunch of different room types: normal rooms full of enemies, upgrade terminal rooms where you can upgrade your ship during the run, shop rooms where you can purchase different weapons, health packs, bombs, or cartridges that give you buffs, and more. Your minor goal is to simply play better and achieve a higher score, but the major goal is to eventually reach the bottom floor of this ancient, abandoned facility and claim the Power Eternal, whatever that means. But in order to reach the next floor and progress further in the game, you need to tackle the mini-boss rooms, which block off the boss door of each floor, and then defeat the bosses themselves. Now, here's the thing. I like roguelike games a lot, that's not really a secret, but I'm not the kind of masochist who enjoys casually playing shoot 'em ups in his spare time. I learned that when I was 8 years old and got a copy of Thunder Force 5 for Christmas. Honestly, I don't think I'm that bad when it comes to hard games, but I'd rather spend my time playing stuff that isn't designed to make me hate life. And after about 8 hours with it, I fear that Star of Providence might become that for me in the late game. I'm not saying it's the hardest bullet hell or shmup out there, I'm not even sure if it's even on the level of difficulty of something like a Dark Souls, By the way, yes, I am insinuating that most shoot-em-ups are harder than Dark Souls games. Watch a video of someone playing Ikaruga or the arcade version of Gradius 3 if you feel like vomiting today. But yeah, it's hard. Which, for some reason, I'm not sure I went in expecting. It's not so rough that I don't think I could take on its challenges with a bit more practice, like I've already been through 4 of the 6 floors. It's just not what I was in the mood for the first time that I played it. My gamer credit aside, I can say without a doubt that it's really creative and that there's a lot to the game. I don't think I've ever seen the exact same room full of enemies or obstacles twice, and there seems to be a roster of multiple different bosses who can appear on each floor, which makes it feel way less grindy and more exciting when you have to restart a run. There's also plenty of weapon types and combinations of modifiers they can roll with that change the way they behave, and even some super rare unique weapons that are really nutty. I'll let you fill in the blanks with the names since YouTube probably doesn't like the word, but the one that I've tried charges up for a few seconds and then just obliterates everything in front of you. It's like the equivalent of picking up the BFG in Doom, but it also doesn't feel completely overpowered because some enemies have immunity windows, which means you have to sync up the time that you start charging up with the time that they'll become vulnerable. It's just really novel and fun to use. Star of Providence also has some of the most energetic chiptune music I've heard since the first couple chapters of Deltarune came out. They start off kind of hopeful sounding when you're exploring the upper floors and then get more frantic and anxiety inducing the further down you travel. They really help set the tone for how much of a terrible time you're about to have dodging thousands of bullets and struggling just to survive. If you're looking for a game that really challenges you to get good, this one's right up your alley. Though if you're able to, I'd recommend playing it on PC with mouse and keyboard. I tried it with a controller, and I thought I would like playing with the dual sticks better, but it turns out the accuracy of the mouse was just too good for me to pass up. So yeah, those are 5 of the new games I've been playing since the start of 2025. Hopefully I showed you something interesting or gave you an excuse to try one of them out, and maybe I'll do this kind of video again sometime down the road. But as for now, I'm LegenTerry, and I'll see you around later. Bye.